Welcome to the Trigger Warning Talk podcast, where we have uncensored conversation. We exchange information, and we have a bunch of resources for all the viewers and the listeners of this worldwide podcast. I said it, worldwide podcast. That's what www means to me. We worldwide, Rasha, because you're in Switzerland, and we're bringing you back here for another episode talking about one of our top subjects, which is human and sex trafficking. Oh, it's gonna get good today. Telling y'all, please believe it. If you're triggered at any point during this podcast, please call 911 if you need immediate help. If you are in the UK, you can call 999. You can call 112 or 143 if you're in parts of the world like Geneva, Switzerland. If you don't need immediate help, but you have some interesting information that you want to share, hey, give us a call, send us an email. If you need some help with substance abuse issues, whether it be alcohol or drugs, call Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, or Al-Anon. If you're suicidal at any point, know somebody that's suicidal, you can call toll-free 24/7 here in the U.S., 988. Again, that's 988. I want to just jump right into it because I just am so excited to talk to my friend Rasha Hammad, founder and CEO of Youth Underground. And, Rasha, I want to welcome you back first and foremost. I know we talked, your episode came out this past March. So if you guys have not listened to it and or watched it, because you can watch these interviews on Spotify as well as our YouTube channel. And we are streaming on all the major podcast platforms. Please start watching these episodes because I have graphics on the screen that you're not going to see if you're just listening. And we love our listeners. We just want you to get the full experience of these interviews. So, Rasha Hammad, founder and CEO of Youth Underground. You got a long CV. I'll have all that stuff in the notes. Let's just jump into what's been going on with you because we got some good stuff today.
Thank you so much for having me. Again, it's always a pleasure and a privilege.
You know what, Rasha? We're going to be talking about the exploitation and human rights offenses, the misinformation. As you heard me say last time when we talked, the money is the source. And we're going to get into the money today. I want to start off by pulling up some notes that I took. And this is from your youth.underground IG page. I was perusing your IG page and I was like, man, some of these topics that we cover don't get the full benefit of conversations. And I know you like talking about these things because I like talking about these things. And I think that most people shy away from some of this stuff, but we're not going to do that. One of the things that I screenshot from your youth.underground IG page is the U.S. is the world's largest producer and consumer of child sexual abuse material, better known as CSAM or CSAM. And according to the U.S. National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, Americans are the largest producers and consumers of CSAM in the world. Please tell us about it.
Well, that's an important fact actually, because when people talk about human trafficking, they think of that it happens somewhere else, but in actual fact, in terms of like population per capita, the U.S. is the largest. First of all, it's the largest consumer, and it sounds terrible to talk about consumerism in when we're talking about human beings, but it's traffickers. Many of them are in the U.S. and the thing that people don't realize is that exploitations occur with U.S. nationals, because one thing that people would tend to think is that it occurs with foreigners, migrants, immigrants, and so on, and that's not the case. It happens with all sectors, all races, all ethnicities, but it happens a lot with U.S. nationals, and that's really important. The second thing is that in terms of producing CSAM, which is, I know this is a trigger warning, but for people who don't understand what it is, it's actually pornography using children. So it's images, X-rated images with the use of children, but it's very triggering for many people, which is why the term has changed. And the largest producers are the U.S. So yeah, that's an important fact to know, which people don't realize, and we talk about it. We don't talk about it all the time because it happens all over the world, but it's an important fact that we do reiterate.
I want to go back to the next graphic. The next graphic, it really intrigued me because sometimes I think that here in the U.S., we tend to take this, oh, it's nothing going on like that here. It's not my problem. It's not something that I need to worry about. It's not happening in my backyard, especially depending on what city, county, state you live in. Sometimes people get a little arrogant and they think, oh, it doesn't bother me here. Or the politicians may not have enough money put into some of these trafficking issues or programs, but every state is affected by it, especially here in the U.S. One of the things that you posted is there are only 24 beds to help sex trafficked kids in California. Wow, 24 beds in the whole state of California.
That's right. That's for children, because what you have, the thing is, children fall through the gaps, and the reason for that is that when you're an adult, then it's easier to find a shelter. If you're a man, you're a woman in particular, you can find shelters for adults. When you're a minor, then it's very difficult to prove that you are actually a victim of trafficking, because you would need like a guardian or somebody to look over you. And many times they are classified as runaways, which is not the case. There's also another point, is that many children, minors who are trafficked, don't realize that they're trafficked. Many of them have been through abuse, and they don't realize they're actually in an abusive situation. And when they are with a trafficker, or a person that has control over them, it's the common comment is, why don't you run away? But for a child, it's extremely difficult, and they feel that they owe in many cases they owe the trafficker, whether it's money, or because what happens is that somebody who is in a trafficking situation initially gains shelter, new clothes, things that perhaps the child did not have, especially if the child came from an abusive household. So when somebody provides them with material goods initially, they feel they owe that person, they need to pay them back in some form. So in many cases, they feel it's a strange, it's not a black and white relationship. It's like there are lots of gray areas, and they feel, they owe them something, they owe their traffickers. And it's, as I said, that there's a lot of fear. What do they do when they leave? If there are no places to go, if adults don't listen to them, they would listen to adults. It's very difficult to find shelters.
We're going to be going back and forth because we're talking about exploitation and human rights offenses, dealing with human and sex trafficking, the misinformation, and the money with Rasha Hammad here on the Trigger One Talk podcast. I'm going to be going back and forth between these two topics, the misinformation and the money, because I want people to understand that both of these things are synonymous with each other. So please just bear with me. There's a method to my madness. You posted on the Youth Underground site that it's all about education. It's inconceivable for many to imagine that the bullying and selling of human beings is actually a profitable trade that happens all over the world. You may not see the problem, but it's there. It's not something that occurs only in dark alleys and far corners of the world. It's happening in all countries every day. Talk about that briefly.
Well, as I said, it happens. Human trafficking happens all over the world, and it's assault, it's exploitation, it's one of the most severe human rights abuses. And when you talk about children, because we focus on youth, address the whole spectrum. We address adults, we address survivors, and so on and so forth. But education for us it's important that people who don't know about trafficking learn so they can protect themselves. And that's very true of children. And I think that adults often don't realize that children understand a lot more than we give them credit for. And even if they don't talk, with their body language, you can tell when something is wrong. So when we do address this issue, which seems overwhelming, children understand, and that's that's what we mean by education. It's a conversation that we have with them so that they feel empowered to do something about it. And it does happen absolutely everywhere. And I remember in the last podcast we had together, the last session, I had told you that the first survivor of human trafficking I had ever met was actually in Geneva, Switzerland. So that goes to show that it happens all over the world, but countries in general don't like to address it because they don't like to show that it happens within their borders. And that's the blame game. They're foreigners, they're outsiders, it's not our problem. But it's a human rights violation. It affects every one of us, and we can all do something about it.
I'm glad you said that, because this goes into my next point, and I want to bring up two of the things that's on the Youth Underground IG page. 41% of child trafficking is facilitated by family members and or caregivers. It says in 2017 at UN Migration estimated that, again, 41% of child trafficking experiences are facilitated by family members or caregivers. And then the next one I selected is 75% of trafficking victims were advertised online over the last 10 years, and that's according to the United Nations. Will you educate us on those things? Because they just really smacked me in the face when I read that.
Well, in terms of the first part, that it's family members, we often talk about stranger danger, but we don't talk about the fact that oftentimes it's people are trafficked by those they know. We're talking about children here, minors. They're trafficked by people they know because they trust. There's a trust that's established. And that's really important. We don't talk about that. We always talk about a stranger, somebody you don't know. Don't talk to people in the streets. Don't contact so-and-so. If somebody comes up to you, don't talk to them, which is correct. But at the same time, we avoid talking about how those we know or our families know and they trust are actually closer to the children and have the children's trust. And the issue with that is that families will believe the predators more than they will believe the child, which is terrible. Adults will believe adults. There's one thing that I want to say linked to that, is that when anyone goes through trauma, you don't talk about it in a linear. It's not a linear conversation like this happened to me, 1, 2, 3. It's like a puzzle because your brain blocks out a lot of what has happened. So what happens is it's like a puzzle, like pieces of a puzzle that kind of fit together, and it's like, the conversation doesn't always make sense, but you can understand by the body language, by just the wording, that something has happened. And because the conversation is not linear or logical, it's very easy to say it's not making any sense. We don't need to take this very seriously. So that's often what happens. In terms of the second point that you said, the trafficking happens online, what increased it or what put it to light was the pandemic. Because during the pandemic and lockdowns, there were over 1.5 billion kids online, students. And that meant students, not only minors, but I say they're youth because they're in their early 20s, and they were online, and some of them were vulnerable, were lonely, and it was a very easy way for predators to contact them, to have conversations. And when you have a conversation with a stranger, it's like, I wouldn't equate it to a therapist because it's not at all that, but when you have a conversation with an outsider, somebody that's outside your family circle or your inner circle, sometimes you feel almost it's less of a responsibility. You're almost more comfortable to share things that mean a lot to you, because that person is a stranger and doesn't know where you come from. It's a strange thing, but you do confide a lot in people. One confides a lot in people one doesn't know. So that's the reason why that the figures are so high. So the thing is, we're not sure whether it happened that the figure was so high beforehand. I think the figure is 2017, so it did, but definitely during COVID and lockdowns, it just increased. And these are estimates, because for the figures to be accurate, survivors have to actually understand that they were trafficked, victimized, assaulted, whatever. There's shame, there's embarrassment, there's all sorts of reasons why they wouldn't go to law enforcement or whomever to share this information. So these are estimates.
I got two more points I want to cover before we really get into the money. Mm-hmm. A child of 12 through 14 can be sold 15 to 40 times every 24 hours, according to the UN. Mm-hmm. And then you got 1 in 3 child runaways or approached by a trafficker within 48 hours. And that's, again, according to the UN. Talk about those two things, because that's just mind-blowing.
Well, in terms of being sold, these are global figures. It's not in a particular country. It's at the average. So some countries have more, some countries have less, but it's a huge, huge figure. And the average age, again, because we're talking about average numbers, it's 12 to 14 throughout the world. Having said that, there are children, and again, I know this is a trigger warning, this podcast, but I would like to underline that what I will say, it can be maybe even might be difficult for people to hear, but some children as young as 4 years old are trafficked and they're sexually abused. 4 years old, 3 years old, 2 years old, toddlers and babies, Larry. So that's horrific. And we've seen it. We have proof of that. We have testimonials, but this is not something that we would share on Youth Underground, because it's something we talk about, but that kind of information is considered extremely graphic. And if people read that, they said, we don't want to have anything to do. It's scary. People don't want to have anything to do with that. And for the other figure, well, it's the same. It's again, average. When there are runaways, children are running away from something, from their home, meaning that they have either been kicked out or they are unhappy with their home situation. They could be living in an abusive household, whatever it may be. So the fact that they're leaving their home and they're living on the streets makes them vulnerable. They don't have shelter, they don't have money, they don't have food. If somebody comes up to them and tells them, I will provide you with shelter, food, and money, they won't say no. They will accept that without thinking further, because it's survival. And that's the reason why within 48 hours, they can be approached. Runaways are approached by traffickers. I want to add something, Larry, is that we mentioned it before, but when we talk about stranger danger, what's important to understand is that traffickers don't have a profile. Predators don't have a profile. They're not people in cloaks, or they look like you and me. They look like everyday people. That's why the education part is so important, because it's what they say and how they express themselves that matters. It's not the way they look, because there is no look. There's no specific profile. They're normal, quote unquote, whatever normal is, but it's the common, as I said, they could look like you, they could look like me. There's no specific look that would say, okay, this is a predator, I need to step away.
This is the Trigger Want to Talk podcast. We are sponsored by Spotify for Podcasters. We are produced by my company, Penton Pending Consulting Solutions, LLC. We are streaming on all major platforms. This podcast is being streamed to a worldwide audience. We have our guest, our friend, my trafficking mentor, back for another episode. I think I might just call it part 2 of exploitation and human rights offenses. We're talking about, this time in particular, the misinformation and the money. Because I always say the money is the source. I don't care what you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
I want to bring back on the screen a couple more graphics. And one of the things I thought about was the money. Traffickers make over $9.5 billion with the B as in Bob.
Mm-hmm.
Annually in the U.S., according to the UN and the U.S. State Department. Please
That's
educate us.
right. Well, that's as we said initially, that the U.S. is the largest producer and consumer of commercial sexual material. So yes, that makes a lot of money. The younger the child is, the more money the child will make for the trafficker. So it's a huge, huge market. Again, it's horrible to talk about consumerism when we're talking about human being, but that's the reality that we're living in.
I want to add to that conversation because that's just in the U.S. Here's another graphic that you all have on your site, which is, if you have not gone to Youth Underground's IG page, OMG, I'm telling you, just phenomenal. Human traffickers earn approximately $150 billion with the B as in Bob per year. Not only is it the second fastest growing illicit trade in the world, it is trying to become number one. I mean, $150 billion a year worldwide.
That's in profits. That's
in
profits, and it's actually profits, and that's a global figure. It's an estimate. People think it's more than that, but it actually is the fastest growing criminal trade in the world. It is the fastest, but it's not the largest profit maker. It's number 2 after armaments. It's the fastest growing.
I mean, even more than drugs. It's like, wow. So I want to jump to the misinformation portion of this conversation. I'm going to give you the mic because I only got a handful of questions, and I always say I got one question in 27 parts. Mrs. LP does not like when I do that, so I'll streamline it down. I got a handful, and I've been doing a lot better with that. This is how we prevent domestic violence in LP's household. The misinformation that you wanted to talk about in particular, that we didn't talk about a whole lot in the first episode, I want you to go ahead. I'm going to sit back. I'm just pushing buttons. You let it rip, cuz don't hold back nothing.
Okay, you can ask me whatever you want, but in terms of misinformation, there's a lot of misinformation out there. And when people see information, films, documentaries, anything about human trafficking, and it's the wrong, and they say, okay, it's good information. In general, the general public would say it's good because there is talk about human trafficking. But I would disagree with that. Our organization disagrees with that because it doesn't do us any good to have information that's wrong. It pushes us back 10 years, 20 years, and we're trying to get the language right. We're trying to get the facts right. So fine, talk about human trafficking, but get it right. First of all, there's something that I want to emphasize is that sex trafficking is one aspect of human trafficking. It is not it's part of human trafficking, because under the umbrella of human trafficking, you've got labor trafficking, forced labor, you've got domestic servitude, you've got organ harvesting, you've got forced marriage, child marriage. So you've got all sorts of things, and sometimes they intersect. So sex trafficking is not synonymous to human trafficking. It's part of human trafficking. So that in itself, when you talk about sex trafficking, you forget all about the other types of trafficking, and they're just as important. Any exploitation of a human being is important. So when that information comes out, you have to get it right. The information has to be accurate, because it doesn't do anyone any good. For survivors who have gone through it and who listen to that, it doesn't resonate with them. They don't have anything to do with it, because the information is completely wrong, and they don't identify with that information. And who best can really give us the correct information if it's not the survivors themselves? And we talk with survivors, so we try and get the information as accurate as possible. So our facts are essentially from the UN, because these are global figures, but we do have other sources, and we definitely talk to survivors who have experienced it, who know what it is, and who can tell us, this is not what I don't recognize myself in this language. I don't recognize myself in what's being portrayed. And so what are we doing here? What are we doing? It's wrong. It's not helping anyone.
On this podcast, the Trigger One to Talk podcast, all 4 words, so when you search for it, it's Trigger One to Talk podcast, folks. We cover sex trafficking and human trafficking. We cover domestic violence, sexually based offenses, true crime, and at the end of every episode, every interview, we cover a missing persons case. And I'm going to be covering the case of a young man that Mrs. LP let me know about, who's been missing. And he has a very interesting story. His name is YOHANES KIDANE. YOHANES KIDANE. And he has a very interesting story that I want to be sharing with you all at the end of this. I want to get back to something that you said, Rasha, because again, we're going to be talking about this misinformation and the money a lot during this episode. As far as the misinformation, I'm a parent. I have, with my ex-wife, we brought 6 children into this world. 5 boys, 1 girl. All the boys are adults, 21 and over. My daughter, she will be 16 for Christmas. I never had a conversation with them when they were little kids about trafficking, because in my mind, trafficking was something that came from across the pond, from Europe, in some shipping containers. I'm from St. Louis, Missouri, so I'm right in the smack dab in the middle of the U.S. in the Midwest. I thought everything that I saw and heard about trafficking back then, and this is way before I got into EMS, so I'm talking about way before, I'm talking about in the 90s, in the 2000s, was stuff that I saw on TV. Like I said, people being shipped from Eurasia in some shipping containers coming to some major point of call primarily on the eastern seaboard, maybe on the western seaboard, and doing some servitude or some sexual-based offenses being done to them or something like that. Or they were coming across the U.S.-Mexico border, and I call them people movers, in some trucks or something like that. I never had the mindset to talk to them about trafficking. I did talk to them about stranger danger. I did talk to them about, be aware of your surroundings and situational awareness and stuff like that. When I got in EMS in 2006, all the way through 2020 and to the present, I have different conversations with them now, because, again, all the boys are 21 and older. I have a teenage daughter now, and I am very concerned because trafficking happens all the time, everywhere, especially in the U.S. Especially when you have a residence in a major city with an international airport, and you have the interstate highways. I mean, those are havens for trafficking. Again, I'm from St. Louis. We got an international airport, Lambert International. We got, Interstate 70 that, starts in the East Coast and terminates in Colorado. That's a lot of states that it can cover to move people, and then that's just the horizontal interstate. We're not talking about the vertical ones that it intersects with. So when I think about just the conversations, I want you to tell us, what should I be saying, or what should we say as parents, as caregivers, to our young folks to keep them in the mindset of situational awareness when it comes to trafficking?
First of all, I identify with what you're saying, because in the 90s, I had no idea about human trafficking. I mean, I learned about it. It wasn't a word that came out. Actually, the word was identified in the year 2000 by the UN. So it's not something that was during our time. I had no idea about human trafficking. So now there are terms, and we're talking about, when you're talking about domestic violence and so on, it's something that we can have open conversations about. For children and your children and the younger children, I think it's important, say, when we start with the younger children, and when I mean younger children, I mean like toddlers. I wouldn't say the word human trafficking, but what's important is that you talk about, it's important to talk about how a child feels when a child meets somebody, even if it's a friend of yours. If a child is uncomfortable, listen to that. Sometimes a child won't be able to put what they feel in words, but you can ask, how do you feel physically? Do you have a stomach ache? Do you have this? And they will express themselves. What do you feel in your body? And they will express themselves. At a very, very young age, they can be 3 years old, and you can tell by their body language if they're comfortable or uncomfortable with somebody. So if they're uncomfortable with somebody, don't push them and say, even if it's a friend of yours, and say, he's a friend, go on, go say hello, hug that person, give that person, how we were raised, like say hello, be polite. No, listen to the child. And when a child is very young, talk about what the child physically feels, and listen, and that's really important. And you can also understand the signs when there are behavioral changes. If a child is withdrawn, quiet when a person is around, that's important. That's establishing boundaries. Once you start these conversations at an early stage, then you continue, and the conversations continue, and they become you can introduce different words, and then you can introduce trafficking, you can introduce assault, you can introduce discomfort, whatever the discomfort is. If a child feels discomfort, there is something that you need to be aware of. When the children are older, when they're teenagers, that's important. And that's when they're interested in the internet, for example. And that's when you talk about, if somebody love bombs you, sends you compliments, and you don't know that person, be aware. If you say no, if a teenager says no, the trafficker, the predator will move on, because they have a pool of kids all over the world. They're not going to waste their time on somebody who says no. Don't be afraid to say no. And another thing is that if you have conversations with your children, or children that younger, pre-teens, teenagers, once you have these conversations, they will be very open with you, more open, and they will feel comfortable enough to say, somebody tried to contact me, And the important thing is to really and listen, and that's the hard part, is to listen without saying, blaming or shaming, or how could you do this and don't do that. Just listen to what the child has to say, and then say, let's work through this together. Why are you interested? Find out, why is the child interested? Why is the teenager interested in this kind of conversation? And then you give your advice. I don't think it's a good idea, and so on. And that you can consolidate the conversation thereafter. So the older they are, the older you can give the facts.
What do you say to young adults, 18 to 21, especially those that identify as women? Because we know a lot of young ladies are going on the gram, and they're, either they're or brand ambassadors for a lot of these clothing designers that, have the body revealing type of clothing. No judgment. I'm just having a conversation. Okay, so don't come at me. They may be advertising BBLs, the Brazilian butt lifts, and they have the procedure done, and look at me now, and just, hey, you know what? I look good. I'm cute. I'm available. Like, how you like me now, or whatever it is. And I'm starting off with young ladies first and foremost. As a parent for someone in that age group, what should I say to that young person in terms of talking about the dangers, the misinformation, and the money specifically?
It's important to talk about several things. One is that once a picture of you is online, it will never go away. And now with AI, no, and they can, now with AI, you've got they can, and that's really dangerous, because they can take pictures and they can play around with them and put nude, take pictures of other people and just superimpose them on each other, and show that a naked child, for example, a naked young adult. So I would say it's extremely important to really stress the fact that when something is online, even if it's for a few seconds, somebody can take a screenshot and that's it. So be aware of that. The second thing I would say is that if you're on live streaming, be careful of posting information of where you are, because if you are in some place and somebody will recognize the area, they can come to that area. So in that situation, if you are on a live chat, live Instagram, live whatever, be with people that you're very good friends, and don't go home alone, don't stay alone. Always tell at least 2-3 people where you are. That's extremely important. Third thing, don't give your contact information, your last name. Don't give your address. Something people would forget is like details like a number plate, for example. You don't think of a license plate of a car. From a license plate, somebody can find out where you are. So these are just cues to help out and to educate young adults. We have actually on Youth Underground, we have a whole section which we added a few months ago on online security. There's actually a very short questionnaire, and it's a yes, no, and what to be careful of. And we give all the details, what to tell teenagers, what to tell parents. It's just recommendations, advice on children, teenagers who feel alone, who feel suicidal. Yeah, there's a whole section there.
Under which link? Under which heading?
It's on its own. It's on its own.
Oh, okay.
Online security. It should be there. that whole section is about how to stay safe online, suicide ideation, what parents should do, change in behavior. Don't minimize what a teenager is going through and think, oh, it's a teenager is depressed, so it's just a phase. Find out more. It's extremely important.
I'm just going to read the headings because I want people to go to your Youth Underground website. Excuse me. You talk about online risks. And some of the things that you talk about is privacy, permanency, grooming, catfishing, impersonation / identity fraud, cyberbullying. And you have a short video on there on the page that talks about online catfishing that I want people to go and watch. Because, again, catfishing with this AI technology now, it's a game changer. It is a
game changer.
And I'm so glad that you brought up the AI component because I was going to ask you about that. See, you always telling me you be reading my mind sometimes, Rasha. I don't know how you do it.
Yeah, we're on the same wavelength. the thing about AI...
Yes.
Sorry, Larry.
No, go ahead.
Sorry, excuse me. It's that one thing is that in the changing of images, you can have an adult play with the AI and make himself or herself, because there are women predators as well, make themselves look like children. So that's the strength of AI. There's also apps that do that. So if it's somebody you don't know, your friends don't know, do not engage. Do not engage.
Women can and are traffickers. Period.
Oh yeah, for sure.
We talked about that the first time that you came on in our exploitation and human rights offenses segment. And I always tell people, it's my podcast, but the guest that comes on, it's their interview. So that's why she's doing the majority of the talking. I'm just, throwing some questions here and there and pushing some buttons, all that stuff or whatever. It's not about me. I didn't want to do a soliloquy-based podcast. We're going to continue, though, because you know what bothers me about some of this stuff in terms of the misinformation, Hollywood. Talk about movies and the films and all that stuff, because you brought up something the other day, and I was like, hold that thought. We're going to put a pin in. Because when I interview you, I want you to talk about it. The mic is yours.
Okay, first of all, I also want to say that it's not about me. It's a cause that's bigger than me. So this is a conversation we're having about a cause that's larger than us, and we're sharing the information. So right. I think that's extremely important. If you're addressing an issue like human trafficking and you make it about yourself, I would question that person. I genuinely would, because if a person makes the issue about them, that's a red flag for me and for our team at Youth Underground. We don't do that, and we're very weary of that. Like, for example, if people say we've rescued, I don't know how many people. You don't rescue people. I don't believe in that. We don't believe in that as an organization, because what we do, we're catalysts for victims and survivors to help themselves and take a path they would take anyway. We're just providing that information, but all credit goes to the person who's lived through it and who has escaped it. So the fact that you're wording it as we rescue people in itself is something we never use, because we don't believe in that. And it takes away the effort and the hardship that a person who has been through trafficking and who has survived trafficking and is going through the healing journey, takes all that away and puts it on the person. So that's something that's important. So I know you're talking about a certain film, and it came out on the 4th of July. It was, before I saw it, I had seen several documentaries that organization had done, and specifically the founder of the organization. He doesn't work for the organization anymore. They were, I won't get into it, but they had legal issues. But all this to say that the film that came out was talked about basically about that specific person who is a white man, blonde, whatever, which is fine, but he saves the colored, Latinos or Latino children, and it's like sensationalized. It's like, I would say, Rambo style, and he rescues the children. So the premise to start off with is very off-putting for me, and I speak on behalf of the organization. So me personally, I felt discomfort without even seeing the film initially, and then I realized that survivors felt the same way. They're like, they didn't identify, because you're putting a white man, like he's the savior of people of different ethnicities, meaning that victims or come from outside the US, which again is a wrong premise. It's misinformation. That film grossed a lot of money. It grossed more than Indiana Jones in the opening weekend.
Wow.
It was screened by Trump. So Trump has a huge following, and that was one of the, I wouldn't say it's one of the reasons, but it's among the reasons why it was extremely popular. And those who were against it, so to speak, I mean, I know survivors were against it. I wouldn't say I'm against it, but those who were uncomfortable with it were kind of categorized as okay, you're on the other side of the political spectrum, and you're either a Democrat or it's a black and white issue. Human trafficking is not a black and white issue. It shouldn't be presented as a black and white issue. It should be sensitive to survivors and those who have lived through it. When you talk about the money, people who have money can make films like that and generate more money. However, how much of it goes to survivors? Nothing. Zero. If you're talking about trafficking, there should be a portion that goes to survivors, to that you can, I mean, if we have access to them, everyone has access to them. And I think it's important that they need the money more than any of us. So the fact that somebody who's already has and good for him, has made money and has been successful, is making even more money based on, I would say, misinformation, made me very uncomfortable. I hope that makes sense.
No, that makes absolute perfect sense, because when we're talking about the money, Rasha, one of the things that I think people don't like talking about is, a lot of times people say, don't count anybody else's pocket or change or anybody else's income and stuff. You can't have that mindset when you talk about trafficking. I mean, you just can't, because again, the root of trafficking is the money. It's like,
absolutely, 100%.
You can't say it's anything else. The root of trafficking is money. Just like, it's not. There's a biblical saying that the root of all evil is money. It's the love of money that's the root of all evil.
Correct.
And so when we're talking about the money, I say, who benefits from it? Because I'm not benefiting from it, and your organization is not benefiting from trafficking. Who's benefiting from it? And we're talking from a worldwide perspective. It's not just the U.S. that's doing it. This is a global.
Absolutely, it's worldwide.
It's worldwide. So who else benefits? So I want you to talk about, and I'm not asking you to name particular individuals. I want you to give me the top 5 of who benefits from sex.
Well, first of all, in terms of money, it's quick money. Because when you initially talked about drugs, for example, you consume drugs once and it's over. The issue with human beings is that you can again consume them, exploit them over and over and over again. So it's quick money, and it's a network. Now, in terms of, so it's a money making machine.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in terms of who benefits, it's people who I would say many people close their eyes to this to trafficking because they might know somebody who's involved in pedophilia or who's involved in sexual assault. And these are people, and these are facts, these are people in decision-making positions who might fear of losing their jobs. It's if you're a whistleblower and you talk about somebody in high government or in a company, in a senior, these are people in senior positions in companies, in the government, in a church, in a mosque. These are people who are the so-called elite of society. How does one bring them down? How does one bring them down without, if you're afraid and you don't want to jeopardize your own position, if you're in a situation of comfort, how do you put them down? How do you take them down, knowing that either they know about it, they're involved in it, they're bystanders, or they're enablers? So to answer your question, the money comes from people in high positions, in positions where they have power, where they can control money. They have money already, they can control it. But you also have the traffickers that actually exploit the human beings. But it's a network. You have as you say, the big fish up there. And I think that there are a couple of examples, but if we can name Jeffrey Epstein, for example.
Sure.
Now,
we talked about him last time. Yeah.
Exactly. Okay. Well, he had tons of money, but then look at who he mixed with. Did any of these people go down? Did any of these people No. None of them did. Nobody did. Why is that? It's that simple. It's that sad and that simple. It's horrific. The Me Too movement, for example, or a movement that comes together like that brings down, like Harvey Weinstein, for example. These are the kind of movements that bring people down, that deserve to be brought down. But if it's a single person, it's very difficult to denounce somebody who's in a position of power, because you've got those around that person who will either doubt you, will ignore you, or will throw you under the bus,
Mm-hmm.
That's the way we focus on things, because when you're educating the younger generation, they're very aware of what's happening. But people who are in comfortable positions will rarely talk about those they know who are involved in any kind of human rights violation. And that's domestic violence. We've seen people, even lawyers, involved in domestic violence. We've seen priests involved in trafficking, rabbis involved in trafficking, imams involved in trafficking. So that's where the money is, and that's where the money goes.
Let's talk some more about the money. This is the Trigger Warning Talk podcast. We're sponsored by Spotify for podcasters. We're produced by Penton Consulting Solutions, LLC. We're streaming on all major platforms. Please watch these episodes on Spotify or our YouTube channel, Penton Consulting Solutions, LLC. We're talking with Rasha Hammad, founder and CEO of Youth Underground, based in Geneva, Switzerland. She'll be here in the U.S. soon. I can't wait.
Yes.
We're
halfway there.
Almost there. I can't wait. Getting back to the money. I'm pulling up your website, and you got a couple of links that are under the visual snapshots. And one talks about consequences of human trafficking. I'm not going to read all of that. I'm going to skip down halfway to
the part. There's a lot of information there.
Yeah, because there's a lot of info. So y'all got to go to her website, youthunderground.com. Youth-underground.com. I'll post the link to your site in the show notes. The part I want to talk about in this particular section under consequences of human trafficking is this. It says on the site that the negative impact of trafficking goes beyond individuals and also affects families, communities, and countries. Once trafficking takes root in a community and is seen as an acceptable way of making money, it then becomes self-perpetuating. Trafficking undermines good governance, democracy, and the economy of a country. It can also have an impact on the reputation of the military and security forces, including peacekeepers, as research has shown that they have contributed to fueling the demand of forced prostitution in former war zones. I want you to talk about that.
Well, that's that was scandals that came out several times. But for example, peacekeepers, people that go and are supposed to maintain the peace in conflict areas, have known to, some of them have assaulted women, raped women. It's not trafficking per se, but it's not that they make money out of it, but they can. And they're supposed to be keeping the peace. And that's happened in many, many conflict areas, conflict zones all over the world. And this is the example obviously is the UN peacekeeping forces, but not only. But I am citing the UN because that was made public a few years ago, and it was horrific. Also, you've got troops that were in Afghanistan, did the same thing. In Iraq, did the same thing. And these are people that are supposed to monitor the peace and make sure that everything is going as planned. That's not what has been happening. Obviously, it's a small it's a minority, it's a small percentage, because peacekeeping forces do a wonderful job. So we can't, I don't want to say that they're all like that, obviously.
Yeah, and we're not saying all peacekeepers, we're not talking monolithic. Yes. Right,
but it takes a few bad apples, as one says, to you lose trust. If you're in that situation and you can't, and you're faced with somebody who's supposed to protect you, that affects you, because then you're afraid after that to go to law enforcement. You're afraid to go to somebody in a position, in somebody that you are supposed to trust. Whatever position that person may, it could be a family member, but also in terms of somebody who could keep who's in a legal position, who's in a position of power. I would be afraid. If that happened to me, I would be afraid to go to law enforcement. I mean, it's a normal human reaction to be afraid. And if you have been through something in that manner.
War zones happen all across the world. I mean, even in the U.S., there are cities that are literal war zones. I'm from St. Louis, Missouri, which has been called the murder capital of the U.S. for decades. And it's gone from 1 to 3. It's always in the top 10, definitely in the top 3, unfortunately. And it's a wonderful city. It's a blue-collar city. It's a working-class city. Mm-hmm. When I think about some parts of St. Louis where I grew up, some parts of the East Side, which is East St. Louis, which is known for. I mean, you say East St. Louis, even if you've never been there, most people know about East St. Louis.
Of course.
The blight, the poverty, the unemployment, the crime, all of these things. I mean, you're talking about war zones. I got stories. I'm not going to get into that today. The reason I bring that up is because when we talk about war zones, I want us to remember that we have to get rid of the stigmas, the taboos, and the stereotypes. And we got a series talking about stigmas, taboos, and stereotypes here on the Trigger Warning Talk podcast. When we're talking about war zones, we're not just talking about like the Ukraine. We're not just talking about Afghanistan. We're not just talking about someplace in Eurasia. We're talking worldwide conflicts that happen. And they happen even here in the U.S. So when you talk about not trusting the military, it's no different than what a lot of melanated folks feel like when it comes to law enforcement here in the U.S. They don't want to call law enforcement about things. They don't want to call law enforcement about domestic violence situations. They don't want to call law enforcement about mental health issues that may have caused a domestic violence situation where that person might be acting out. They're not necessarily trying to hurt somebody else. They have some mental health issue that's going on. And because law enforcement, unfortunately, is not trained enough in mental health issues, and I've talked about that ad nauseum, and I'm going to keep talking about that, you need to have more crisis intervention trained officers in law enforcement. You don't have to defund the police by taking the money away from that department. You can say, hey, whatever your budget is, let's increase the amount of money that's going towards mental health services and programs. Same thing is in EMS. Have more community paramedicine programs. I worked for a company that had a community paramedicine program. And unfortunately, it didn't run long, but that's a different conversation, and we can talk about that in another interview. The reason that I'm bringing this up is because it has a definite tie into trafficking. Because if you're living in a war zone like city, like a East St. Louis or St. Louis, depending on where you live, and crime is happening rampantly all in the metro St. Louis area, and let's say you're in a situation where your caregiver is trafficking you, you're not going to call the cops. If you feel like the cops are going to come and not do shit, if you're in a situation where you're in a trafficking situation where wherever you live, maybe it's a forced labor type of situation, so it's more on the human trafficking side, the forced labor side, you're not going to call the cops if you think, hey, every time I look at the news, some black person that's unarmed is getting shot or killed or whatever. Or you see these breaking news stories and shit. So what you're saying is so apropos. I want us to keep talking about breaking down these stigmas and stereotypes and taboos because of the shame, the drama, the guilt, the judgment. All of these things play a huge part into why people are scared of law enforcement, don't want to get law enforcement involved if they are hurting, if they are injured, if they're dying, if they're being traumatized. There's so much stuff. I want you to respond to anything that I just said before I go on to the next thing about the movie.
Sure. There are two things I want to say is that in terms of like if you do, for example, if law enforcement does hear you and your trafficker, your predator is taken to court, it's like a situation of domestic violence. I find it horrific that the victim or survivor of that person has to appear in court because you're re-traumatized once again. Why do we have to do that? Why does that the person have to appear in front of the victim survivor has to appear in front of the person who exploited them, and they're re-traumatized. They have to talk about the details in front of a public. I think that's horrific. That needs to change. In terms of training, 100%, there's lack of training. So if people don't feel that it's urgent enough, they will remove the funds. So we need to emphasize, like you said, that it's something urgent. And then the last thing I want to say is that I went to Silicon Valley a few years ago, and you've got the tech companies, big money tech companies, and then outside their area, you've got people that are trafficked. It's another world. Do they care? Are they doing anything about it? No. It's shocking, and we need to call it out for what it is. I mean, I'm not going to sugarcoat it, but I didn't expect that at all.
Here's one thing that I want to point out about the money. It goes back to something that you had talked about before, when we were talking about that 150 billion a year in US dollars. So I'm saying 150 billion with a B a year. On your website, it says how much profit does human trafficking generate? And again, according to the 2017 September report from the International Labor Organization and Walk Free Foundation, human trafficking is believed to generate profits of US $150 billion a year. The following is a breakdown of profits by sector. $99 billion from commercial sexual exploitation, $34 billion in construction, manufacturing, mining, and utilities, $9 billion in agriculture, including forestry and fishing, and then $8 billion saved annually. $8 billion is saved annually by private households that employ domestic workers under conditions of forced labor. Please talk about that.
Well, domestic servitude can fall, when we talk about, it's not black and white. Somebody who's in domestic servitude can be in forced labor, so they work 7 days a week. They don't have hours. They don't have a contract. Their passports can be taken from them. But at the same time, they could also be used for sex. So that's where the two overlap. And it's not that, they're not like complete black and white categories. So the issue with domestic servitude, again, is that if there's a housekeeper in a home and the housekeeper does not go out of the house, or it's very difficult for neighbors to see that. They need to, I can't say they need to, but they could be living next to somebody who is being trafficked domestically. So that's something. Another thing is that in terms of, I would say, Switzerland is an example, because we have many UN organizations and many diplomats. Diplomats have immunity. So if they have housekeepers or domestic help, and they're abused, they don't have, nothing really happens to them, because it's state against state.
You know what I didn't think about when we were talking about having this conversation, and we're talking about the misinformation and the money. I want to bring it back up on the screen here, your website, because your website is freaking phenomenal, and whomever all had a part in that. My flowers to you all, because it is just fucking phenomenal. I just can't say it. Climate change and human trafficking. You talk about misinformation. I would have never put climate change and trafficking in the same sentence. But listen, you all say desperation enables human trafficking to flourish. Talking about climate change and human trafficking. Climate change increases the risk of natural disasters such as droughts and floods, places a strain on livelihoods, and leads to migration and displacement of people to more promising regions. People on the move find themselves in vulnerable situations and become easy prey for traffickers. Many women or girls who are the most poor and vulnerable become subjects of sexual or subjects to sexual exploitation or forced labor or both. Quote unquote climate migrants find themselves desperate for security and work and as such become easy targets for human trafficking. I've never heard of the term climate migrants. Please enlighten us on that.
Well, you said it when you read it. It's when there are natural disasters, people leave their homes and they lose their jobs, or for whatever reason they move. People on the move are vulnerable, and human trafficking preys on vulnerability. So vulnerable people who want a better life, who seek a better life, can fall prey to somebody who tells them, I have a job for you. I have, again, job, food, money, provide that security that they've lost. And when you're desperate and you want to survive, take any helping hand you can. So we don't talk about changes in climate, but look at what's happening in the world: the floods, the fires. It's ongoing, and people are moving, and the fact that they move means they lose their livelihood, their security, and they are vulnerable. They are in a vulnerable situation.
Dag nabbit, Rasha. We're gonna have to do another part because I'm gonna give these 27 parts of this question. I'm there's a piece to be upset for a little bit. We're just gonna have to do it. We're just gonna have to continue talking about this stuff because I'm mind mapping right now. My ADD is kicking in, but I want to do a 50-hour podcast. I can break them up. That's okay. I do have one more point I want to raise.
Mm-hmm.
And going back to what we talked about when we talk about the obstacles, because again, we're talking about the money also. So on your site, you talk about obstacles to combating human trafficking, and it's going to kind of reiterate some of the points, but I just want to bring it to a close here. Obstacles to combating human trafficking.
Most of it goes to the work. You're not paying salaries or anything. You're going to the work, to the actual work that we do. So when you do donate, we will give you a rundown of where your money is going, and we're very transparent about that.
I got it on the screen here, folks. That's why I say please watch these interviews because you're gonna miss it, but that's okay. 15% goes to advocacy and communication. 5% goes to management and admin. All donations to Youth Underground are 100% tax deductible and contribute to investing in programs that sensitize and benefit the youth, people of all ages, promoting youth initiatives and activities that combat human trafficking, engaging the youth to develop activities, discussions, and tools that combat human trafficking, and communicating worldwide positive youth initiatives that combat human trafficking. All this stuff is on the website, folks. So this organization is legit. This company is legit. The work that they do is legit. Rasha Hammad is so legit. Like if you just Google Rasha Hammad, you're gonna get a whole Library of Congress of her work that she's done. Like her family did work for the UN, her parents, and that's how she got into doing this public service work. She worked for the UN for a while, and they got her to doing the work that she does now with trafficking. I mean, look, I want to get an official copy of your CV going all back. I want to know how many pages it is. I don't want you to say it right now. We'll talk about that later. Yeah, I'm just saying, I want to get the whole CV. I want you to send that to me in an email sometime today or this week because I just you so fascinating because you have done so much, Rasha. I mean, damn, like you're just the bomb, and I'm telling you, I appreciate you. We're gonna go ahead and wrap it up here. I'm gonna go ahead and let you go so I can do this missing person case.
Sure.
When we talk about trafficking, we talk about some of these stories that sometimes people don't really want to get involved. I want you to hold on, because I want you to listen to this. I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'm just going to read parts of it. This comes from celebsweek.com. It's about a young man named YOHANES. He was an employee of Netflix. They talk about a number of things in this story. YOHANES. He was a software engineer for Netflix. He was listed as missing, age 22 years of age. He was born May 5th, 2001. Birthplace, Tompkins County in New York State. Gender is male. Nationality American. He got a zodiac. He's Taurus. Ethnicity African American. Body measurements 5 foot 8 inches, centimeters, because I know you guys did the metric system over in Switzerland. So for your benefit, it's 175 centimeters, and in meters, it's 1.75 meters. Weight in kilograms is 68, and pounds is 150 pounds. Eyes brown, hair black. His parents, his mother, her name is Hannah Beyene, Beyene. No information about his dad. He has a brother named Joseph KIDANE. He went to Webster Shorter High School and Cornell University. His family is concerned about his sudden disappearance, which happened here in the States in San Jose, California. He had relocated to San Jose this July, and had just begun his second week of work at Netflix when he went missing. His brother said that he took an Uber from his apartment building, and this was on August 14th around 7:15 p.m., and that would be Pacific time. He was as seen wearing gray sweatpants, a black hoodie, and black shoes. His brother, along with their father, flew from New York to the Bay Area in search for YOHANES. Surveillance footage from his apartment building captured him getting into a black Toyota sedan with an Uber stick. And he had mentioned to some of his co-workers that he was headed to San Francisco, possibly to meet a friend. However, his phone trackers has remained static near the Golden Gate Bridge since Monday evening. You know, his phone was while his backpack or discovered south of the Golden Gate Bridge in a public area near the Welcome Center and coffee shop. And a commuter discovered his phone and wallet on Grassy Hill and turned them over to the Marin California Highway Patrol office. His backpack was located, containing 2 laptops and personal documents, and they reported the case to the San Jose police, and they are actively seeking information. This could be a trafficking situation because, again, like you said, all genders can get it when it comes to trafficking. He was in Silicon Valley. I was there a couple years ago doing the stop and bleed training. You know, if you have any information, they have a couple phone numbers to contact his mom at 585-500-5220, or his brother Joseph, which is YOHIEF KIDANE, same last name, at 585-489-4880. Again, if you have any information about YOHANES S. KIDANE, contact his mom at 585-500-5220, or brother at 585-489-4880. In closing, I want to say, keep your eye and your ears open. Remember situational awareness. It's not a matter of if, but when and where any emergency is going to happen. We want you to be a by-doer instead of a bystander. That's a quote from our work partner, Dexter Pagans. We also want you to learn how to be an immediate responder until a first responder shows up and you take over patient care. That means learn how to do stop the bleed, CPR, AD, choking, all of these different things, because they're important. And any age can learn these things. For Rasha Hammad, I am your Fire Medic CEO host. LP out.